10-Minute Jazz Lesson Podcast, episode 102. Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of the 10-Minute Jazz Lesson Podcast. What's going on? How are you? Hope you had a great week and hope you're ready to learn some more here. We're going to be continuing our series on secondary dominants, but now we're actually going to talk about how to use them and some of the advantages we have now, knowing what they are, knowing where they happen, what we can actually do to put these into action. So before we get into the show, I just wanted to remind everybody that you can get the PDFs to all of these episodes on our Patreon site. That's patreon.com/10-minute jazz lesson, or you can go onto our website and click on any of the Patreon banners and it will bring you right over there so you can get signed up. Wanted to give a big shout out to everybody who signed up to be a supporter this past week. We had a bunch of people join the 10-minute jazz lesson team. The first person is Miles Davis, which is pretty cool. We must be getting pretty popular if Miles Davis just pledged $3 for us. Stephen Wands, Michael Skupinski, and David. So thanks to all of you for joining the team, for showing your support for the podcast, and really keeping this thing going. A reminder, we're going to have our first online masterclass for Patreon members coming up on April 22nd, which will actually be 3 days after this podcast comes out. What we're going to do is we're going to talk more about chord substitutions, and once a month we're going to hop on an online Google Hangout masterclass, and we're going to go really in depth into a particular chord substitution that we can use in a particular place. And we're really going to pick something totally different every month and do a 1-hour deep dive on a particular chord substitution. So this is really going to up your playing. It's really going to give you some new stuff to think about, some new stuff to study. And this is available for our Patreon supporters. So I will be dropping a link on the Patreon site on that Sunday. I think we're going to do it at 11 o'clock New York time. And I will be recording it. So anybody that can't make it to the actual hangout, there is going to be a recording of it that I will link to from the Patreon site. So if you're not a Patreon supporter yet, this is another great reason, on top of getting all the PDFs and all the stuff that we put over there, to sign up, pledge your $3 a month, and now you get a 1-hour masterclass every single month where you can ask questions, and we're going to go a lot deeper than we can on the podcast. So head over to Patreon and sign up. All right, let's jump into today's episode. So last week, a little bit of a review from the last episode. We talked about secondary dominants, why they're important, and where they happen. And like we often do on this show, we use the blues as an example because, as you guys out there know, I truly believe in the blues as a vehicle for teaching because it just gives us so many of the devices and chord progressions that we're going to see in other tunes, but it's still accessible. So we're going to continue with that. But this week, we're going to take the next step and we're going to talk about how we can use these secondary dominants, our newfound knowledge of secondary dominants, to create tension. Because let's think about this for a second. A dominant chord, the 5-to-1 motion of music, is where we create the majority of our tension. So if you look at a 2-5-1 progression, we're going to create the most amount of tension over that 5 chord before it resolves to the 1 chord. So it's a really perfect place to build the tension and then resolve it when we get to the 1 chord. So if you think about the term secondary dominance, we're dealing with dominance still, right? So that gives us this fantastic opportunity to create a bunch of tension over these chords. And when you listen to your favorite artists and you hear all of this tension release, a lot of it comes over these secondary dominants because we don't get that many cadences that go back to the one chord, right? Like in the blues, we really only get two of them. We get the 2-5-1 in bars 9, 10, and 11. And then we get that 5 chord going back to 1 at the end of the progression. And that's where we create a lot of our tension. But if you listen to some of your favorite jazz players, you'll hear that they're actually creating tension in a lot of other places. And I'm willing to bet that they're creating those sounds over some of the places that we're going to go over today. So if you haven't listened to last week's podcast, this is where I want you to stop this recording, stop what you're doing, and go back and listen to last week's episode, because you're really, really going to need that as a base of operations for what we're going to talk about today. You have to understand what the secondary dominants are. So let's do a quick little review here for everybody that did listen to the episode last week. We created a secondary dominant in bar 4 of the blues, and this is one that escapes a lot of people because it's literally the same chord as the bar before. We're using the 1 chord as a dominant to go to the 4. So in a B-flat blues, we are using the B-flat 7 chord as a 5 of the E-flat 7 chord. And there's nothing that kind of shows us that we're going to use this as a dominant. It's kind of just a given, but that can fly over a lot of people's heads. So what we're going to do is we are going to use the tritone substitution, the good old tritone substitution. I feel like that's an accessible place. We've talked about that on the podcast before. That's the tension that we're going to use. And in particular, we're going to use the triad from the tritone substitution. So if we look at measure 4, typically we'd be playing over a B-flat 7 chord. What we're going to do is we're going to replace that with an E triad, right? That's the tritone substitution of B-flat 7 would be the key of E. So we're going to, instead of playing B-flat 7 there, we're going to mess around with an E triad, which is going to drop us into the E-flat 7 chord in bar 5 with a half-step motion, therefore creating a bunch of that tension, dropping us into the E-flat 7. Let's look at the next place we talked about the secondary dominant, and that is measure 8. So typically what we were using was the 6 chord, or the way that we discussed it last week, we're using the 5 of 2. So we're using a concert G7 chord to get to our concert C minor 7 chord in bar 9. So let's take the tritone of G7. That gives us a D-flat triad. So in bar 8, we're going to be using that D-flat triad. And what I've done on the PDF this week is I've written out all of the regular changes, but I've written in the tritone substitutions in red. So if you're looking at the PDF from this week, which you should be, the substitute chords are going to be in red. So we've got that D-flat triad in red there. All right. Then we're going to go through our 2-5-1 progression. We're also going to create a tritone substitution over our regular 5 chord, our non-secondary dominant, our primary dominant. We're also going to do a tritone sub on that. So in bar 10, where we would normally have an F7 chord, we're going to use a B triad to play over that, create our tension there. And then in the last bar, where we would use our F7 chord again, we're going to play in B as well. So while we're dealing with these tritone substitutions, we're also going to use them over our primary dominants as well, because we're really trying to get that sound into our ears. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to play a couple of choruses, creating tension over these secondary dominant cadence points. And what you're going to hear is that it sounds like it goes way out and then it comes back in. And that's really, really the goal. This allows us to take our solos to the next level because we're creating tension in places that previously we weren't, or didn't know that we could use tension there because we weren't aware of these secondary dominants. So let me play a couple of choruses inserting these tritone substitutions, and I really want you to concentrate on bar 4, bar 8, bar 10, and bar 12, and listen for that tension and release in those measures. So it's pretty tough to miss the kind of out sound, the substitute sound. And this is one of the things that I just love about the secondary dominants is it gives you so many more opportunities to create that tension. That's really what music is all about, is tension and release. That's why music has such an emotional impact on us, is because it creates that feeling of highs and lows and tension and release and happiness and sadness. And jazz is really beautiful in the way that it can do that very rapidly, and I think we can get a lot more of those really, really tense sounds when we're playing jazz. It's more acceptable. So I just love this stuff. This really, really gets me going. I love teaching about this stuff. And if you're interested more in like chord substitution, so creating more of that tension and how that works, that would be a great reason to join us on the 22nd, this Sunday, to really do more of a deep dive on how the tension gets built by using chord substitutions. All right? So if you have any questions about this or anything else, make sure you email me 10minutejazzlesson@gmail.com. And I hope to see a lot of you on Sunday. And if I don't see you on Sunday, then I'll see you on Monday for the Motivation Monday podcast. All right, have a great weekend, everybody. Get to work on some of this stuff. I promise you it will really pay off, and it's super fun to work on. All right, talk to you soon. Bye.